In the square of a medieval Roman city, the fountain suddenly breathed. Not water, but thick, glossy blood, pulsing like a heartbeat. Anyone who touched it felt a surge of rage, betrayal, and centuries-old secrets twisting beneath their skin. Red veins writhed across hands and wrists, revealing who had killed, who had lied, who had betrayed. People screamed, but their cries were lost in the metallic scent of iron filling the air. By dawn, the square was empty, yet the fountain stood as a living judge, each splash of blood an accusation, each pulse a sentence. Could you pass by it and remain the same? On the eve of All Hallows, the fountain at the center of the square began to tremble, each stone lip quivering as if straining against the weight of centuries pressed into its carved body. The air was unusually still, the kind of silence that presses into the ears and presses the chest, and then the first spurt of liquid rose, thick and slow, deep red and glossy, moving with a pulse that seemed to echo a chorus of hearts long dead. It was not water, but something alive, something that seemed to breathe in rhythm with the city itself, and the scent of iron was sharp and clung to every surface, sinking into the cobblestones and seeping into shoes, leaving a taste of rust and old blood at the back of the throat. The red liquid shimmered under the dim torchlight, a strange, sticky viscosity that dripped in spirals and arcs, and as it fell, it struck skin and stone alike with a subtle tremor, leaving a faint warmth that crawled along veins, tracing hidden paths that should have remained secret. Those who stepped closer felt a heat crawling beneath their flesh, a quiet, insistent electricity pressing against nerves, as if the fountain were weighing each heartbeat, reading each hesitation, drawing forth the treacheries long buried in the marrow and sinew. Shadows clung to the edges of buildings, stretching unnaturally in the torchlight, curling toward the fountain's pulse, bending and twisting like serpents in time with the slow, deliberate rhythm of the crimson spray. Each droplet seemed to carry memory, vibrating with the echoes of knives struck in secret, the sudden betrayals of brothers, the whispers of merchants poisoned in hidden rooms, and the liquid itself seemed to coil around the ankles of the unwary, tugging with a subtle insistence, marking them with a resonance they could feel deep in the chest. The square, once empty and mundane, became a stage for something beyond comprehension, alive with a patience that pressed into the bones, pressing outward from the fountain's heart, shaping the air, bending the light, filling the lungs with the metallic tang of accusation. The wind, though faint, carried the pulse across the stone, threading through narrow alleys and beneath doorways, brushing along the bodies of those who lingered with an invisible caress, leaving red-tinged patterns beneath skin, serpentine lines that writhed faintly, following tendons and veins, mirroring thoughts that had never been spoken aloud. Even the pigeons that circled above hesitated, their wings slicing through the suspended droplets, leaving feathers tinged with the coppery hue of blood, and the sounds of the city, the distant bells, the clatter of wheels, the muted footsteps of late wanderers, seemed altered, slowed, as if the pulse of the fountain had entered the rhythm of the world itself. Each breath taken near it tasted faintly of rust and damp earth, embedding in the memory, embedding in the sinews, and those who dared to place their hands upon the stone felt the liquid pulse through them like a tide of other people's anger and betrayal, veins beneath skin twisting, pulsing with lives not their own, stories of murder, theft, and secret cruelty wrapping into the contours of flesh. By the time the moon hung low above the rooftops, a sickly copper glow reflecting off the crimson surface, the square had become a cathedral of sensation and dread, every stone, every shadow, every heartbeat caught in the unyielding rhythm of the fountain, patient, eternal, and hungry for acknowledgement. By the next morning, the square lay in an eerie stillness, deserted, the only movement the relentless, silent pulse of the fountain, sending its thick crimson liquid skyward in arcs that fell back onto the stone like living rain. Each spurt rose higher than the last, a wave of dark red that glimmered in the pale dawn, coating the edges of the basin with a sticky film that refused to drip completely, clinging as if intent on permanence. Footsteps approached cautiously, hesitant, small and measured against the cobblestones, leaving wet impressions that darkened the stone and glistened with the reflection of the fountain's own heart. Yet the red liquid did not remain passive. It seemed to sense each approach, quivering in anticipation, rippling forward in subtle arcs, thin threads of color stretching across the gaps between stones, brushing ankles, crawling up shoes, rising toward exposed skin with an almost imperceptible intent. Those who stepped closer felt a heat stirring in their veins, a pressure beneath skin and tendon that was both external and intimately their own, a sensation as if the fountain were reading the hidden ledger of their flesh, tallying secret acts, counting sins buried long ago, twisting them into small coils that began to pulse beneath muscle and bone. Tiny veins of red appeared under the skin, serpentine and delicate at first, winding across wrists, forearms, and hands in patterns that seemed impossible, yet undeniably present, curling in on themselves with a slow, deliberate motion that echoed each heartbeat. Thoughts they had never admitted, whispers they had never spoken aloud, acts of theft, betrayal, and subtle cruelty unfurled within them, mirrored by the crimson threads writhing beneath the surface, mapping each hidden transgression in a language that burned as much as it bled. The air in the square had turned thick, metallic, suffocating, a tang of iron that invaded nostrils and throat, settling on tongues like dust from some long-forgotten crypt. Even the sun that rose above the rooftops seemed dimmed, its pale light refracted through the floating droplets, casting the stones in a sickly copper glow. Birds that normally scavenged in the open square hovered above in hesitant circles, wings catching the red spray, feathers dusted with droplets that clung in strange, unnatural patterns, leaving streaks of scarlet on the wind, as if the fountain's influence had spread even into the air itself. A single pigeon that dared land on the fountain's edge flinched violently as the liquid curled toward its talons, flowing upward, climbing the thin hairs along its legs, and leaving faint, twitching impressions along its skin that vanished the instant it took flight, leaving only a sense of tension and memory in the air. Those who lingered too long beneath the fountain convulsed subtly, a tremor through muscle and sinew, involuntary, as if some invisible rhythm pressed against their spines, bending them into compliance with an unspoken choreography. Fingers flexed and curled, shoulders tightened, elbows jerked in delicate synchrony with the pulse of the crimson, patterns forming across their bodies that were mirrored by nothing else in the world, a private record of guilt and apprehension visible only to their own nerves. The square seemed alive with this invisible orchestra. Even the shadows that stretched across the stone walls of the surrounding buildings twisted in tandem with the movement beneath the skin, flickering and folding, curling in slow arcs that mirrored the coils of red veins crawling along forearms, backs of hands, and across collarbones. Every breath taken carried the weight of the fountain's presence. The metallic taste clung to lips, settling in teeth, leaving a faint, sticky residue in the throat, embedding in memory in a way that could not be shaken. Time seemed to fracture within the square, the usual progression of hours suspended as each pulse of liquid brought with it the sensation of centuries, the accumulated anger, fear, and treachery of countless lives. Those who had approached the fountain felt themselves drawn into an impossible intimacy with the past, the crimson threads beneath skin connecting them to hands that had struck, knives that had slit throats, eyes that had watched betrayals unfold, all winding through their veins as if they had been there themselves, witnesses and participants in crimes never committed in their own lives. Some trembled, muscles twitching with small spasms, the pressure coiling along their spines, forcing them to bend knees and tilt shoulders, subtle acknowledgments of the ledger being written invisibly across their bodies. Others stumbled backward, hands clawing at the stone, desperate to escape the crawling heat that pressed from beneath their skin, but the crimson flowed like water itself, following each movement, climbing, coiling, returning with relentless precision, leaving the delicate tracery of guilt etched into each sinew. The cobblestones themselves seemed to pulse beneath footfalls, small tremors resonating through the feet and into the spine, a feedback loop between body and fountain that refused escape, pressing each heart into the rhythm of the red liquid. The fountain's surface shimmered constantly, rising and falling as if breathing, sending droplets into the air that lingered longer than physics should allow, clinging to clothes, hair, and skin, dripping in slow arcs that left stains invisible yet insistent, marks of presence that would not fade. Even the walls of the surrounding buildings seemed to lean subtly toward the square, the stone pressing inward as though compelled by the same pulse, the same memory, a silent audience to the horrors etched into the flesh of those who dared approach. As the sun rose fully over the city, the crimson spray reached higher, each jet cutting arcs of deep red across the pale morning, streaking the windows of homes, balconies, and markets, sending shards of reflection into eyes that had never witnessed the fountain before. Those who gazed upon it from a distance felt a creeping heat along their forearms, small curls beneath the skin that mirrored the fountain's flow, an intimate and terrifying recognition of sins they had long denied. Even without touching the water, the square became a theater of acknowledgement. The invisible tracery beneath skin pulsed in time with each heartbeat, each thought, each memory, until the air itself seemed alive, vibrating with the knowledge of betrayal, theft, and murder that had once passed unnoticed. Each moment beneath the fountain was an eternity of sensation, the metal taste in the mouth growing stronger, veins beneath skin writhing with private revelations, and the city itself seemed to lean closer, the stones of the square hot beneath feet, the walls tight, the shadows closer, as if pressing all life into the pulse of the crimson liquid. By midday, even the boldest passerby faltered at the edge of the square, watching the fountain with a mixture of awe and horror, feeling the threads beneath their flesh tighten and pulse, a living map of sin, memory, and accusation that moved in tandem with the heart of the city, unstoppable, unrelenting, and patient beyond understanding. The fountain's pulse had grown relentless by the third day, each jet of thick, crimson liquid shooting higher and faster than before, the arcs catching the pale light of the morning sun and refracting it in subtle flashes that resembled eyes, blinking and watching from the surface of the stone. The air around the square was dense, heavy with the metallic tang of iron that seemed to seep into every pore, clinging to hair, skin, and clothing, leaving a residue of memory in those who lingered too long. Whispers began to rise from the liquid itself, low and urgent, a cadence older than Latin, older than the city itself, a rhythm of anger, betrayal, and vengeance that seemed to thread through every heartbeat in the square. Those who dared place a hand upon the fountain felt the rush of other lives consumed by treachery and sudden violence, surge into their veins like a river of flame, threading through muscle and tendon, twisting marrow with images that should have remained distant. Knife strikes in shadowed corridors, poisoned cups lifted to trembling lips, sudden betrayals by those sworn in blood, the theft of children, the slow strangling of trust, all coiled in intricate spirals through the nerves of anyone who touched the liquid, leaving faint, twitching veins beneath skin that mirrored the movement of the fountain itself. The crimson threads under flesh throbbed in tandem with the pulse of the liquid, weaving an invisible ledger of sins across each arm, wrist, and hand, expanding over shoulders and collarbones, carving maps of acts committed centuries before and those that would unfold centuries hence. The fountain seemed to feed on these revelations, growing hotter, the stone itself emanating a pressure that pressed into the feet, legs, and spine of every onlooker, a weight that could not be resisted, bending bodies into subtle acknowledgments, forcing each muscle into a rhythm dictated by some ancient intelligence embedded in the blood. The city beyond the square trembled in response, walls vibrating with a frequency too low to hear, yet tangible in bones and teeth, doors rattling in silent resonance, shutters quivering as if the buildings themselves sought to lean closer, to witness, to submit to the fountain's demand for recognition. Birds that flew overhead hesitated in midair, wings frozen, droplets of red clinging to feathers as if marking them with the same language that traced beneath the skin of those below, leaving patterns that shimmered faintly, twisting with the heartbeat and pulsing with a consciousness older than the city itself. Those who lingered too long began to feel more than just the thread of memory. They felt the pressure of intention, as if the fountain were reading their thoughts before they formed, marking their hesitations and secret impulses in veins that writhed and shifted with subtle precision. Fingers flexed and curled involuntarily, shoulders tightened, backs arched in slow acknowledgement of sins not yet confessed, and yet entirely known to the fountain, which seemed to guide each twitch, each contraction, each subtle shift of posture. The cobblestones beneath feet grew slick with the dripping, sticky red, reflecting in pools the faint, flickering glow of the liquid above, as if the fountain's heartbeat had seeped into the stones themselves, drawing the city's life force into its rhythm. The sun, climbing higher in the sky, cast long, uneven shadows across the square, shadows that seemed to curl and twist independently, stretching toward the fountain with a serpentine grace, mirroring the writhing veins beneath skin, bending light in impossible angles, capturing each heartbeat, each tremor, each contraction of muscle in the faintest reflection. Even without touching the liquid, passers-by felt a creeping warmth along their limbs, small coils forming beneath flesh, a recognition of deeds long buried, of words unsaid, of betrayals imagined or realized, until each body became a map of culpability, a living manuscript in resonance with the fountain's pulse. Some convulsed, small spasms running along arms and shoulders, muscles shifting in silent obedience, as if being rehearsed in an invisible choreography of acknowledgement. Others fell to knees, hands pressed against stone, hearts hammering with the weight of histories that were not their own but felt as intimate and inescapable as memory itself. The fountain's jets rose higher still, droplets suspended in the air, clinging to clothes and hair, leaving traces of residue that would not wash away, mapping the unconfessed sins onto fabric and flesh alike. Those who dared turn away could feel it in their spine, in their chest, the pulse threading along veins, pulling attention back, bending thought, bending posture, bending existence to the fountain's rhythm. Windows rattled faintly, shutters trembled, and even the stone walls of nearby homes exhaled a subtle vibration that threaded into marrow and sinew, a living, accusatory hum that pressed each citizen into the same ledger of guilt. By midday, the square had become a cathedral of sensation and dread. Each jet of crimson was a heartbeat, each arc a pulse of knowledge, each droplet a sentence in a record older than law, older than conscience, older than life itself. The air shimmered faintly with heat, metallic and suffocating, pressing into lungs, settling in sinuses, embedding itself in memory, leaving an aftertaste of copper and despair. Those who had resisted the fountain now felt threads under skin tighten, curling more insistently around veins, pulsing in tandem with the liquid above, weaving acts of treachery, murder, and betrayal into patterns impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. Small coils expanded over shoulders and back, faint tremors crawling along the neck and down the spine, forcing acknowledgement in subtle, involuntary motion, bending joints in ways that mirrored the histories the fountain carried. Each twitch, each contraction, each heartbeat became an act of recognition, an involuntary confession, a participation in the living, breathing ledger that the fountain demanded. By the end of the third day, the square was no longer simply a place, but a conduit for centuries of rage, a mirror of all human treachery, the pulse of the fountain threading into bone and tendon, sinew and marrow, embedding memory and judgment in those who dared enter, leaving no one untouched, no one unmarked, no one free. No priest could bless it, no magistrate could condemn it, and no commoner dared linger in the square for long. Yet the fountain continued its relentless work, each night erupting higher than the last, sending thick, dark blood in trembling arcs that spattered windows, rooftops, and narrow alleys with a persistence that seemed impossible. The air was saturated with the metallic tang of iron, sharp and acrid, carrying the scent of decay and violence through every street, infiltrating every home, seeping into every corner where the living dared dwell. Those who wandered too close, drawn by morbid curiosity or unseen compulsion, felt the red liquid reach toward them as if with purpose, tiny filaments of crimson tracing invisible paths in the air before settling on skin, clothes, and hair. When contact was made, the veins beneath flesh reacted instantly, contracting in serrated lines that twisted around tendons, across wrists, up forearms, and over shoulders, coiling with a precision that suggested intent, as if the fountain itself were writing an account directly into the living body. Some felt heat ripple through their bones, a deep vibration in marrow and sinew that left them trembling, while others convulsed subtly, muscles flexing without conscious thought, small spasms that mirrored knife strikes, sudden betrayal, or the instant of blood spilled centuries ago. Dreams became an extension of the fountain's judgment. Nights were filled with screams not their own, cries of anguish from lives they had never lived, visions of strangers plunging blades into the unprepared, poison dripping into goblets, secret conspiracies unraveling with sudden and meaningless violence. Sleep offered no reprieve. Upon waking, their waking minds were haunted by the same flashes of terror, fleeting glimpses of betrayal and slaughter that clung to memory like iron filings to a magnet, impossible to brush away. Even those who fled the city could not escape entirely. The fountain's influence followed them, subtle at first, a curl beneath the skin, a pulse in the veins, a fleeting heat along the spine, but persistent, relentless, tracing a map of culpability across their bodies that they could neither see nor deny. Its reach stretched over hills and through the winding streets, slipping through cracks in windows and under doors, pressing against stone walls and wooden beams, seeking, testing, claiming the hidden guilt of any who had harmed, deceived, or betrayed, whether through conscious intent or careless neglect. The very city seemed to bend under its pressure. Shadows leaned unnaturally, corners grew darker even in full daylight, and the air vibrated faintly, a low hum of accusation threading through walls, streets, and rooftops. Windows rattled as though whispering, shutters flexed with invisible hands, and the stones beneath footfalls pulsed in rhythm with the fountain's heartbeat, each tremor pressing into bones and muscles, bending posture, curling fingers, forcing acknowledgement of acts long forgotten or unrecognized. Mothers who peered through their windows felt tiny curls beneath their skin, tracing the moments they had turned away from children, the words left unspoken, the betrayals of trust that had seemed insignificant but were now marked in delicate, serrated tracings across forearms and wrists. Merchants who had cheated or stolen in markets felt the pulse climb along veins, a heat that surged up shoulders, across necks, into the spine, forcing subtle shifts in posture, fingers twitching as if acknowledging the ledger the fountain wrote invisibly upon them. Even the youngest children, who had done no more than lie or covet, woke with faint red veins under skin, small arcs that pulsed with the heartbeat of centuries, a silent accusation that pressed on marrow and sinew before fading in light only to return when shadows deepened. The fountain's liquid leaped higher with each nightfall, droplets suspended impossibly in air, clinging to hair, fabric, and skin, each carrying a pulse of memory, a fragment of centuries of rage, betrayal, and blood spilled in secret corridors, narrow alleys, and shadowed rooms. Those droplets followed them, fell upon rooftops and streets far from the square, leaving faint traces of residue that crept invisibly into walls, sinks, and door frames, embedding memory and judgment where no eye could see, pressing into the very air with subtle insistence. Priests could not offer absolution. Blessings faltered in their hands. Prayers turned to whispers of static as if the fountain swallowed devotion itself. Magistrates could not command it. Their edicts fell like dry leaves on the stone, ignored, dissolved by the crimson tide that obeyed no human law. And yet the fountain demanded recognition, threading into each living body it could reach, twisting muscles and veins in delicate choreography, bending tendons into acknowledgement, imprinting unseen maps of guilt that could not be washed, scrubbed, or burned away. By the seventh night, even the most hardened citizens dared no approach. The square was empty, windows shuttered, doors bolted, streets quiet as if the entire city held its breath. But the fountain pulsed on, jets of blood leaping higher than before, droplets suspended, curling, twisting in slow arcs that mirrored the writhing veins beneath every person it could touch, every hidden sin it could find. Each heartbeat of the liquid was a judgment, each splash a verdict, each pulse a sentence that threaded through sinew and marrow, threading the city itself into a ledger of centuries, endless and patient, relentless, insistent. The square, once a place of gathering, became a conduit for centuries of rage and betrayal, a theater of judgment visible in the twitching veins of those who had seen too much, touched too much, or even walked too near, the fountain claiming, pressing, marking, and never forgetting. And in the dead hours before dawn, when the air hung thick and metallic, the city itself seemed to bend toward the square, stones leaning, shadows curling, doors trembling as if in recognition, all waiting for the fountain to rise once more, to claim new veins, new sins, new bodies, and remind the living that no act, no betrayal, no secret could remain untouched, unmarked, unjudged. By the 14th day, the fountain had grown into a monstrous nexus, a beating heart of crimson energy that seemed to draw the very city into its rhythm, each pulse shaking the cobblestones beneath feet and vibrating through stone walls with a subtle, insistent pressure that pressed into marrow and sinew alike. Jets of thick, dark blood shot higher than ever, arcs suspended impossibly in the air before splattering across rooftops, balconies, and the narrow alleys that twisted between buildings like veins themselves, each droplet carrying with it a pulse of memory, a fragment of anger, a taste of betrayal that clung to hair, skin, and clothes, impossible to brush away. Those who dared glimpse one another across the square saw it instantly, veins beneath flesh pulsing, twisting, writhing in serrated lines that mapped the unspoken sins of both centuries past and those unfolding in the present, a living ledger that could not be denied. The patterns moved with a strange intelligence, coiling over forearms, across shoulders, down torsos, tracing knife strikes, stolen gold, whispered lies, and secret acts of cruelty, pulling muscle and tendon into subtle acknowledgement even as eyes widened in terror. The city descended into a convulsive frenzy. Merchants collapsed mid-step in the square, clutching arms as the crimson lines spread across them, following the pulse of the fountain, inscribing betrayal into every vein, twisting joints into involuntary contortions. Noblemen shivered in their high chambers, curtains fluttering as droplets struck stone and wood, leaving faint, crimson fingerprints that pulsed faintly in time with the fountain, an echo of the hidden deeds they had long believed were secret. Children, still too young to understand the full weight of human sin, woke screaming, eyes wide and wet with tears, seeing the blood-threaded webs beneath skin, glimpsing betrayals committed before their birth, small and terrible, twisting in coils around veins, threading down spines and across the chest. The air itself seemed thick with accusation, a metallic haze pressing against lungs, teeth, and tongue, each breath carrying whispers of violence, greed, and hidden resentment, mingling with the scent of copper and iron that seemed impossible to escape. Those who fled the square felt the fountain's reach stretch across the city like tendrils, slipping through cracks in doors, threading beneath floors, pressing against the living as they ran, forcing subtle shivers, small twitches, the faint pulsing of acknowledgement beneath the skin, invisible but undeniable. No one could meet another's eyes without recoiling at the reflections of crimson veins, the twisting ledger of guilt that marked every hand raised, every finger flexed, every hesitation acknowledged as a secret long buried. Even the dead were not spared. Graves in the cemetery near the square seemed to shiver as if in resonance, soil trembling with each beat of the fountain, the air above thickening with the copper scent of blood, and the subtle pressure of memory pressed outward, as though the fountain reached across the veil, threading accusation and recognition into all that it could touch. The fountain pulsed, each beat stronger than the last, responding to thought, to hesitation, to fear, anticipating the next act of treachery, the next whispered lie, the next betrayal of trust, and forcing muscles, veins, tendons, and spines into subtle, involuntary acknowledgement. Windows rattled, shutters flexed, doors quivered, and even the stone walls of the square hummed with low, accusatory vibration that threaded into bones and marrow, bending posture, curling fingers, twisting shoulders into patterns dictated by the fountain's will. Droplets of blood hovered in the air for a heartbeat longer than gravity should allow, clinging to hair, clothing, and skin before settling with a faint pulse, leaving residues that would not wash away, inscriptions of guilt visible only to the senses, palpable beneath the flesh, threading nerves and muscle into a ledger that included every citizen within reach. By nightfall, the square had become unrecognizable. No one dared enter, and those who peered from behind shuttered windows or from hidden alleyways trembled as droplets leapt higher, arcs tracing impossible trajectories before falling, each jet a heartbeat, each splash a sentence, each pulse a judgment, threading through both the living and the sleeping. The fountain did not merely exist. It demanded acknowledgement, bending bodies and city alike into its rhythm, weaving together centuries of bloodshed, treachery, and betrayal into a single, living manuscript of terror, a ledger that pulsed with the heartbeat of the city itself, patient, eternal, relentless, and utterly without mercy. The night air carried the faint hum of its pulse, metallic and insistent, vibrating through the very air as if the city itself had become a single, enormous vein, the fountain its heart, each jet of blood a command, each droplet an execution, each pulse a reminder that no act, no thought, no betrayal, no secret could remain unmarked or unjudged. By the end of the 14th day, the fountain had claimed not just the square, not just the city, but the pulse of all who lived within sight, threading the past, present, and future into veins that writhed and twisted beneath skin, forcing recognition in subtle convulsions, leaving the living a map of guilt they could never erase, never escape, never hope to survive unscathed. On the 20th night, the fountain erupted with a force that shook the city to its foundations, a single, shuddering pulse that shot crimson liquid high into the air, arcs twisting impossibly before splattering across rooftops, balconies, and narrow streets, turning the city into a cathedral of blood. The torrent was thick, heavy, carrying the scent of iron and something older, something primordial, a taste of centuries of rage and betrayal that hung in the air like a shroud over every stone, every shutter, every shuttered door. The cobblestones trembled underfoot as droplets struck with a weight beyond mere liquid, leaving patterns of twisting red lines that pulsed independently, coiling over the edges of the stones, threading into the cracks, mapping histories of treachery and murder, sins committed in shadow and secret, waiting to be acknowledged. Those who had lingered vanished in the violence, leaving behind only fragments, their skin etched with serpentine veins that writhed and throbbed, as if the pulse of their own terror had been recorded into flesh now abandoned to the square. Windows shattered under the force, shutters ripped from hinges, and the narrow alleyways carried the sound of splattering, each droplet a heartbeat, each splash a sentence, each arc a judgment carried across centuries of hidden human cruelty. By the time the torrent slowed, the square was empty, silent, yet impossibly alive. The fountain had transformed, twisted itself into a grotesque sculpture of coagulated figures, limbs bent at unnatural angles, eyes wide in frozen accusation, mouths stretched into eternal screams of those who had been claimed, their faces twisted with every betrayal, every act of greed or cowardice that had ever been committed within the city walls. The stone itself seemed to breathe, pulsing subtly beneath the weight of the frozen forms, sending vibrations into the ground that threaded into the roots of trees, the stone of nearby buildings, even the air itself, carrying a metallic tang that would not fade. Shadows stretched and contracted in the flickering lamplight, forming the shapes of vanished citizens in impossible configurations, ghostly echoes of the writhing veins that had once traced themselves across arms, shoulders, and torsos, now immortalized in stone, a ledger of blood written in sculpture and pulse. Streets leading from the square were deserted, cobblestones slick with the memory of the storm, carrying the faint residual pulse of the fountain into alleys and courtyards, pressing a subtle, insistent pressure against anyone who dared cross it in thought or imagination, a lingering heartbeat of accusation threading through stone and air. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the vanished had taken its voice, leaving behind only the murmur of pulsing veins embedded in stone, a rhythm that could be felt in chest and stomach, as if every citizen had been folded into the fountain's ledger, every heartbeat mapped, every sin recorded in a choreography of eternal judgment. Travelers who dared pass through the square afterward spoke of a low thrum beneath the stones, a cadence that echoed in the soles of feet, up legs, through the spine, pressing involuntarily on muscles, bending posture, curling fingers without conscious thought, a residual imprint of the fountain's terrible power. Some claimed the air was alive with whispers, unintelligible but insistent, a chorus of voices carrying the anger, betrayal, and fear of those long dead, mingled with the pulse of the living whose lives had been claimed, threading across centuries in a single, unbroken rhythm. Even at midday, the iron scent lingered, subtle yet omnipresent, clinging to hair, clothing, and skin, and those who remained in the city felt veins beneath their flesh twitch in response, red lines faintly visible as though the fountain had not relinquished its claim, had not released its ledger of torment, but continued to thread its influence invisibly through every living muscle. The fountain, now a twisted cathedral of frozen, pulsating figures, seemed to watch, patient and eternal, each arc of coagulated blood frozen mid-motion, each face an accusation, each limb a reminder that no act of betrayal, no hidden knife, no whispered lie, no act of cruelty could escape the ledger that had been written into the stones, the air, the veins of the living, and now the immortalized sculpture itself. Travelers spoke of dreams filled with splattering blood, of visions of their own hands and hearts traced with serpentine lines of anger not their own, images of betrayal curling around their spines, hearts pounding in time with the fountain that no longer flowed with liquid but with memory made solid, each pulse a sentence, each quiver a verdict. Even centuries later, those who approached the square swore they could feel the heartbeat beneath the stones, could smell the iron tang hanging faintly in the wind, could see the twitching of veins beneath imagined skin, as if the fountain continued to pulse with life, wrath, and judgment beyond human comprehension, patient, eternal, relentless, and utterly unforgiving. The city had been emptied of its flesh, yet the fountain remained, a grotesque monument to the impossibility of escape, a living ledger of all treachery, rage, and betrayal threaded into stone, air, and memory, pulsating with a rhythm that could be felt but never defied, a witness beyond time, beyond mercy, beyond hope, and beyond the will of any living soul.